If a revolution was already beginning, you wouldn't see it. There wouldn't be a single moment, no clear starting point, no event you could point to and say, that's when everything changed. Because real revolutions don't start with chaos. They start with pressure. Slow, structural pressure that builds inside economies, institutions, and everyday life. Right before systems collapse, leaders often speak with the most certainty. The language becomes absolute. The outcomes sound final. The crisis, they say, is already over. It never is. And by the time anyone calls it a revolution, the outcome is already decided. The French Revolution didn't start with the storming of the Bastille. The Russian Revolution didn't begin with the Bolsheviks. Those were just the moments history remembers. The real beginning happened years earlier, in rising prices, in falling wages, in systems that stopped working for the people inside them. And in each case, there was a moment where everything still looked stable from the outside. That's the moment we're interested in, because right now, there's a growing sense that something isn't quite holding together the way it used to. The system still functions, markets still open, elections still happen, but beneath that surface the pressure is building. And history suggests that when enough of these pressures align, the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. So the real question isn't whether revolutions happen. They always have. The question is whether we recognize the pattern while we're still inside it. But if you want to understand the systems shaping the world before they break, subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon. Because most people only see history after it happens. And this channel is about seeing it while it's still unfolding. Let's go back to France in the late 1780s. Not to the riots, not to the executions, to the years before any of that. France wasn't collapsing overnight. It was eroding. The government was drowning in debt after decades of war and royal spending. Nearly half of its budget was going just to pay interest. At the same time, most of the population lived at the edge of survival. Bread wasn't just food. It was survival itself. For many families, it made up the majority of their daily spending. Then the harvests failed. Not once. Repeatedly. Supply dropped. Prices surged. And suddenly, the average person was spending almost everything just to eat. That's when the pressure started to shift. Because people don't revolt when they are starving. They revolt when they were almost stable, and then fall backwards. That gap between expectation and reality is where revolutions begin. And while ordinary people struggled, the system above them froze. The monarchy delayed decisions. Ministers argued. Reforms stalled. From the outside, it still looked like a functioning state. Inside, it was already fragmenting. By the time bread riots began spreading across cities, the outcome wasn't being created, it was being revealed. The same pattern appears again in Russia, more than a century later. Before 1917, Russia wasn't in open revolt. It was under pressure. A massive empire with deep inequality, millions of peasants living in near-feudal conditions, a government struggling to modernize. Then came war. World War I didn't just strain the military, it broke the economy. Food shortages spread. Inflation surged. Cities filled with soldiers who no longer believed in the system they were fighting for. And just like in France, the government didn't collapse instantly. It hesitated. It delayed. It tried to maintain control without solving the underlying pressure. By the time protests began, the authority of the system was already gone. The revolution didn't destroy the system. It exposed that it had already failed. France wasn't unique. Russia wasn't an exception. Different countries, different timelines. But the underlying structure of collapse followed something far more consistent. A pattern that repeats often enough that it stops looking like coincidence. When historians study revolutions, they don't just look at events, they look at patterns. And one of the most consistent patterns comes from a simple observation. Revolutions follow stages. First, the old order weakens, not dramatically, just enough that it starts to lose its ability to respond. Economic growth slows, inequality rises, institutions become less effective. Then comes frustration. Not immediate anger, not violence, just a growing sense that something isn't working. People begin to notice the gap between effort and reward, between promises and outcomes. After that, something more subtle happens. Trust begins to disappear. Not all at once, but gradually, across different parts of society. People lose faith in governments, in media, in financial systems, in the idea that the system is fair. And once trust begins to erode, everything else becomes unstable, because systems don't run on force alone. They run on belief. After that comes fragmentation. Different groups begin to see reality differently. They stop agreeing on basic facts. They stop trusting the same institutions. The system becomes divided against itself. And finally, there is a breaking point. Not necessarily a war, not necessarily violence, just a moment where the system can no longer hold together the pressures placed on it. At that point, change becomes inevitable. This pattern repeats across history. Same sequence: pressure, frustration, loss of trust, fragmentation, then change. The form changes, the pattern doesn't. Now step into the present, because what makes this pattern unsettling is how familiar parts of it start to look. Start with inequality. Over the past few decades, the distribution of wealth in the United States has shifted dramatically. A growing share of total wealth now sits with a very small percentage of the population. At the same time, wages for many workers have remained relatively flat when adjusted for inflation. Productivity increased. Corporate profits increased. But for a large portion of the population, the sense of economic progress slowed down. That gap matters. Now add debt. The U.S. economy is heavily supported by borrowing. Government debt has crossed levels that historically only appeared during major crises. At the individual level, household debt, from credit cards to student loans, continues to rise. Debt itself isn't new, but sustained dependence on it creates fragility because it limits how systems respond under stress. Then there's inflation. For a brief period, inflation surged to levels not seen in decades. Prices rose faster than wages, and for many people, that translated into something simple. Life became more expensive. Not dramatically overnight, but steadily. Enough to be noticed. And once people begin to feel that shift, it changes how they view everything else. Now, look at trust. Public trust in institutions in the United States is near historic lows. Trust in government, in media, in large corporations, even in financial systems. Across different political groups, for different reasons, the same pattern appears. People believe the system is not working the way it should. That matters more than any single policy. Because once trust declines, systems lose stability. They require more effort to maintain the same level of function. And then comes polarization. not just political disagreement, but deep division. Different groups operating with completely different interpretations of reality. This isn't just disagreement over policy, it's disagreement over what is true. And when a system loses shared reality, coordination becomes difficult. At that point, even small crises become harder to manage, because there is no agreement on how to respond. Put all of this together, and something becomes visible. But there's another layer to this pressure that doesn't show up immediately in data. It shows up in behavior, in how people interact with the system when they stop believing in it. Across history, this shift is subtle at first. People begin to withdraw. They stop participating the way they used to. They disengage from institutions they once trusted. In late-stage France, tax compliance dropped. Local officials ignored orders. Informal networks replaced formal authority. In Russia, soldiers deserted not because they were defeated, but because they no longer believed in the system they were fighting for. That kind of disengagement is difficult to measure, but it changes everything. Because systems depend on participation. And in the United States today, signs of that shift are becoming harder to ignore. Voter turnout fluctuates unpredictably, not always driven by engagement, but often by frustration. Trust in mainstream media has fractured into isolated information ecosystems. Large numbers of people are opting out of traditional career paths, financial systems, even home ownership, not always by choice, but increasingly by perception that the system no longer rewards participation the way it once did. At the same time, alternative systems begin to grow. Decentralized finance, independent media, parallel communities forming outside traditional structures. Historically, this is what happens when confidence in centralized systems weakens. People don't immediately revolt, they erupt. The United States is not France in 1789. It's not Russia in 1917. The structure is different. The scale is different. The power it holds globally is unmatched. But patterns don't depend on identity. They depend on pressure. And right now, that pressure in the US is not theoretical. It's measurable. Housing costs in major cities have moved far beyond wage growth. Ownership, once considered a baseline milestone, is increasingly out of reach for younger Americans. Healthcare costs continue to rise faster than inflation. Education, once a pathway upward, now comes attached with long-term debt that follows people for decades. Individually, each of these is manageable. Together, they create something else, a system where forward movement feels slower, and in some cases, reversed. That shift matters more than absolute numbers. Because revolutions are not driven by how poor a society is. They're driven by how much the future stops looking better than the past. The US economy is still growing. On paper, it remains one of the strongest in the world. But the distribution of that growth has changed. A larger share of wealth is concentrated at the top. Asset ownership, stocks, real estate, has become one of the main drivers of wealth accumulation, which creates a divide between those inside that system and those outside it. If you own assets, the system feels like it's working. If you don't, it can feel like you're standing still while everything moves ahead without you. That divide is not just economic. It becomes psychological, because it changes how people interpret fairness. Then comes institutional response. In previous eras, pressure like this was often absorbed through reform, policy adjustments, economic shifts. structural corrections. But that requires something critical: coordination. And that's where the current system begins to show strain. Political decision-making has slowed. Major policies take longer to pass, face stronger opposition, and often get reversed before their effects fully play out. Long-term planning becomes difficult. Short-term reaction takes over. And when systems shift from proactive to reactive, they start losing control over direction. So the real question isn't whether change is coming. It's whether we can recognize the pattern before it reaches the point where nothing can stop it. Because by the time history becomes obvious, it's already too late to control it. If you found this perspective valuable, subscribe. Because the most important stories aren't the ones making headlines. They're the ones unfolding underneath them. And once you start seeing the pattern, you start seeing it everywhere.